Mark, ever so good of you to join us this evening. Very nice to see you. Tell us about Carrie Bourassa. I hope I'm pronouncing her surname correctly, but she tends to go by another name.
Yes, and what's interesting, the examples you cited there, she is merely the latest of what we might call the flight from white, which I can well understand. It's if you're told, as we are told constantly, about white privilege and systemic racism, it's either kind of shameful or embarrassing or just merely socially rather tedious to be white, which is why we have all these perfectly white people now pretending to be something other than what they are. Carrie Bourassa is pretending, I think she pretended to be an Algonquin Indian, and more than that, once you go down this path and you pretend to be an Indian or you pretend to be black like Rachel Dolezal, you don't just say, okay, I used to be a white dentist and now I'm going to be an Algonquin Indian dentist. They actually became activists and, as it were, racial grievance mongers. So people are adopting these identities in order that they can join the victim class instead of being in the alleged oppressor class. Well, they're not really cashing in. They're trying to overcome the so-called affirmative action that discriminates against them. I mean, I've been advising young American high school students for decades now just to claim to be, something in the Elizabeth Warren realm, not to claim to be something like 1/16th Indian or 1/16th Latino, because it's like just far enough back that makes it hard to trace. But otherwise, I happen to be an Irish, Belgian, Canadian. I didn't ask to be born that way, and it happens that there are three loser categories that are useless if you want to get into Harvard and Yale. So it's perfectly reasonable, I think, if the establishment has incentivized this form. Harvard, for example, Harvard Law School promoted Elizabeth Warren as its first so-called woman of color. Now, my old joke about Elizabeth Warren is that she's the whitest, I think that I used to say the whitest white since Frosty the Snowman fell in a vat of Tippex. She's whiter than anything you've ever seen. And yet, when she was promoted as Harvard Law School's first woman of color, nobody laughed. Again, like this lady in Canada, she became a professional Indian, as it were. She submitted a native Cherokee recipe to the Pow Wow Chow cookbook. And it turned out that her native Cherokee recipe, it was a crab and tomato dish, for which the Cherokee are renowned. It was, in fact, from a Midtown restaurant in Manhattan from the mid-20th century, where it was a favorite dish of the great Broadway composer Cole Porter and the late Duke of Windsor, which would mean the Duke of Windsor was a Cherokee, which would mean Her Majesty the Queen is a Cherokee, which would mean that the best way to end the centuries of American racism would be to destroy the monarchy. This is the logic of the insane world we live in.
And it's a logic that seems, by your lights, Mark, to say that what matters first and foremost is your lived experience. If you feel you're secretly Somalian, then Somalian you kind of are. And yet, isn't the trend perhaps that just beginning to go in the opposite direction? Is that these people are being found out, and when they are found out, it's as we saw in that clip from President Bush, you become a figure of fun.
Well, I think up to a point. The interesting thing is that Elizabeth Warren was not laughed out of electoral politics for passing herself off as Cherokee for decades. The same thing looks like happening to Madame Bourassa in Canada. A lot of people are rallying around her. And it's interesting to me, for example, if I were to write a novel from the perspective of an Algonquin Indian, I would be accused of cultural appropriation, and half the interns at the publishing house would demand the book be pulped. But on the other hand, so that's if I write a book from the perspective of an Algonquin Indian. But on the other hand, if I were to actually say, hey, I am Algonquin Indian, and adopt some, Indian name straight out of some pathetic Disneyfied Indian princess movie, as this lady has done. If I was actually to purport to be an Indian chief or an Indian maiden, people would be far more forgiving than if I just, as I said, wrote a novel with an Indian character. You can self-identify. If you, Colin, decide tomorrow, you wake up tomorrow and you decide you're a woman, we will all accept that. And heaven help anyone who mispronouns you. But we haven't quite got there yet on race. And once we do, once it's as easy to transition racially as it is in terms of your sex, then I think there's going to be very few white people left in the world. Because who wants to be the last oppressor? There's going to be a 97-year-old guy. A 97-year-old guy somewhere in the middle of New Zealand who will be the last white oppressor on the planet, and every other white person will be pretending to be an Abenaki Indian.
Fantastic. Mark, it's lovely to talk to you.